honorable sisters and brothers and friends, and that includes all peoples all over the world that really want reasonable employment and life without somebody trying to taking their land or taking their work and ability and exploiting it. I'm forced to say that the aUSsaA was transformed by that immoral, murdering robber, grand theft artist, especially of my science and inventions. J. Edgar Hoover, a liar, grand theft artist, immoral, homosexual, injured, murdered, experimented Americans to death, and knocked off those who tried to replace him. A representative, a FBI hero. Yours truly, he tried it. Just good people. President Kennedy realized that, well, there were inside powers that gave him the chance, but then he decided, and of course Hoover would have ways of making sure he knew who and what might replace him. That was his number one priority over whatever. And then he realized that what Kennedy figured was, okay, now when I'm reelected, now I've done it from the people, not from inside powers that allowed me. And one of the first things I'm going to do is to replace Hoover. Well, then Hoover moved and had Kennedy taken out. And then he had the power, of course, to investigate what happened. And it was that report, official report of the pristine bullet, and the bullet went this way and that way and so forth. And some people even laughed at the preposterous circumstances of how a president could be assassinated, could be murdered. Who had the power? It was the official investigator, official report, had control of the commission as to what the report would then say, etc. Now, I'm 87, and I've survived not because Hoover wanted me to, barely, by a split second. One little mistake, and nobody ever heard me again. And the real inside of how they were able to say obtain, where I said, well, it's God and country, and two wrongs don't make a right. And they convinced me that we were actually at war. And when you think about it now and look back, yeah, they've been at war continuously and they're at war against the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans say they want to sign a peace treaty, and the U.S. says there's preconditions and won't sign a peace treaty because they want to be technically at war, actually at war And I was in a position where we could maybe lose. So I had been taught certain military science by a colonel from West Point that was real good. And that's the way I went at it. They're training me to be an officer, and I decide what's best, and we do that unless it doesn't work out. Not that I have, well, this is my opinion. Oh, okay, I'll agree with somebody else. No, if I am sure I have the best opinion, the best program, I go forward with that. And that was, of course, to at least match anybody, which I accomplished. And now come to find out, the U.S. is getting always worse of this Hooveristic, immoral type of society where they use lies and money. They print the money and military use of the military to obtain. What they do is to actually take over, especially a smaller country, for some pretense, especially if Israel gets them to go against an Arab country, because that's what the Zionists want, always more power and expansion. And the aUSsaA is in bed with the Zionists. So it turns out to be where the Zionists are saying the Christian and the Jews against the bad Arabs. Well, they're calling the Arabs bad because the Arabs and the Palestinians want their country. It was their land when the Jews moved there from Egypt. Who was living there was the inhabitants. Yeah, the Palestinians were there. And it's still really their area. Well, I'm for the Jews that were there to have their area of their tribes, not that they're going to take over Palestine and practice genocide. Of all people to practice genocide is the Jews. But the Zionists now are worse than Hitler. They're worse than Hitler. They're murdering as many Arabs as they can and practicing genocide, especially against the Palestinians. That is the real truth. And I say, yeah, I was, I think, the advance forward soldier, so to speak, in what to do. But I was lied to, and then they took my science. You better believe I invented the Xerox, X-E-R-O-X, X is the infinite variable mathematical physics, in light application, stimulation of obtaining in-phase optical pumping coherent beam, the futuristic multi-purpose laser coherent beam. Put this on a voice stress analyzer, or I'll take a polygraph lie detector test, pay for it, but you print the results. They were going to have me on the national lie detector program. But then they says, oh, well, we can't do it. Why not? Well, the cost. I'll pay for it. Oh, well, no. And they says, well, no, we were told from the higher power couldn't do it. Well, that was Hoover. I used to call Hoover, his best I could say about the fellow was he's a director of employment, not of the FBI. To do any kind of real good work, the government, they would investigate you and rate you, and if they didn't want you to have a certain position, you couldn't get that. And if you tried to get Hoover out, there was a representative that dropped dead with the speech in his hand that he was going to give when the train arrived in Washington, D.C., to the reporters. They found him dead on a train. He suddenly died with the speech in his hand. There was Melvin Purvis, who was a great FBI even hero. And they said, well, you know, there were some of those that knew Hoover was what they say a bend over for politicians. He was a evil fella and a homosexual. So they said, well, I get Melvin Purvis. And he says, well, if you want me to, yeah. Hoover got him out of the FBI. And they found him dead, shot. Then Hoover's official investigation said he shot himself. It's almost getting mean by a split second. A bullet had both windows open. Through the window, I leaned back. Wow, I got close. One little slip and I'd be dead. Accident. Hoover experimented my brother to death and others. My brother was about 6 feet, good physical man, all-American boy, popular, great dancer. Girl, you know, ladies liked him. And just the opposite of Hoover. He was a homosexual, living buddy with his number 2 fella, Clyde Tolson. So what was then, it was a pyramid of power with Hoover at the point, and everybody, he had blackmail on anybody in the government, senators, candidates. And, he had Kennedy killed because Kennedy said, well, now when I'm reelected, I'm going to replace him. He had Martin Luther King murdered. Why? Because Martin Luther King was publicly saying he should be replaced, and Martin Luther King knew what I was tempted to try to have brought forward was that Hoover was a pass for white. He just didn't match with the rest of the family. And there's a Millie McGee, I think it is, or McGee. You go on Google, California school teacher Millie McGee, but it might be spelled G-H-E-E. She has absolute proof that down south there was Hoover owners, like of a plantation, and then they mixed with the blacks. So there was the Hoovers, and then some of the Hoovers, and Hoover was a pass for white, so they shipped them up to the Hoovers that moved up to Washington, or Washington. And you'll find if you can, I say can, but if you can get his birth certificate, it's been altered. He has a phony birth certificate. So Martin Luther King was reverend, though, and I said, politician is a politician, but you can't murder a reverend. It didn't make any difference to Hoover. So you have Martin Luther King murdered, because Martin Luther King maybe was about ready to expose him, and Hoover would kill anybody that tried that. And that Millie McGee, it's 14-something already. I've got to have part 2 then. That the absolute truth that he murdered her uncle and maybe others that wanted to expose him. Well, this is part 1. I have to go part 2.